So the third type of migration that I wanted to focus on in this class is environmental migration or environmental refugees. Hopefully you've noticed from the last video that there are specific criteria required in order to be considered a refugee, and that is why I think a lot of people refer to people who are forced to move due to environmental reasons are often considered environmental migrants. A definition from one of the readings for today, which I think is a useful kind of overview of environmental migration. Those people who have been forced to leave their traditional habitat temporarily or permanently because of a marked environmental disruption, either natural or triggered by people, that jeopardize their existence and or seriously affected their quality of life. A few elements of this definition that I think are relevant: the fact that there is some kind of environmental disruption. Less focus here is the ones that are affected by people. Often it is because of a natural reason, although as we'll see later on in the food and water weeks, that because of environmental factors that could lead other people to be brought into conflict environmentally, economically, or violently with other groups of people, and that could in turn lead to migration, and that the quality of life is affected by these outside forces. And so people feel like they need to move in order to deal with these challenges. There is no mention of environmental factors in codified international law. I mentioned the 1951 convention in the last video about who would be considered a migrant. And there is no mention of environmental factors in who's considered a refugee. And so therefore people who stake claim to refugee status would have to still link these kind of environmental factors to government persecution, and the main deciding factor is less the environmental factors. As with other things we've covered in this class, it's more of a background condition or multi-step process to leading to conflict. And so people, when they're faced with these kind of challenges, either of relative scarcity, absolute scarcity due to environmental factors, which we're going to look at in more detail in the next couple weeks after the teaching break. One of the articles talks a little bit about Hirshman's ways that people can cope with a challenge. He calls it exit voice or loyalty, and I think Swain is useful in trying to link it to the Aruvani. I forget who it is. It's getting late. You can either do nothing and accept the costs of environmental induced scarcity. You can stay and try to mitigate the changes, or you can leave and become one of those environmental migrants. And for me, as a child of the 80s, it made me think of these choose your own adventures. And it's a really horrible analogy, but it's the way that you can kind of see that there is agency for the people who do make these individual decisions, that while we often focus on people as a group, like refugees or internally displaced people, these observed population movements, like with the videos in the Darien Gap, are a product of both individual level decisions that are shaped by group level factors, structural and background conditions, often related to the environment, right? So people get to make these choices. Do nothing and accept the costs is the most direct, that you just accept the costs of the environmental change. This snapshot is from the increasing levels of flooding that occur in Bangladesh. Also from Bangladesh, you can mitigate and try to you can stay and try to mitigate the changes that these environmental shifts are causing. Here you see a floating garden with periodic flooding. It can be impractical to try to plant produce in the ground because it could be flooded. While if you have floating gardens, regardless of the flood, the garden should theoretically raise or lower. It's a creative way of trying to mitigate change. We're going to talk more about that in week 11 and week 12. That the floating gardens reminded me of Where I used to live in New Orleans, there was a lot of ways at trying to adapt to the changing risk of living in that area. Lower Ninth Ward, one of the poorest parts of New Orleans, that was also one of the hardest hit by the failed levees in 2005. And as a result, you can see the houses that were rebuilt. The one on the right was raised up to be able to adapt to the increasing risk of flooding. Often it cost money to be able to try to raise houses. I used to see advertisements on telephone poles for places specializing in raising houses. Some government support was given for people to be able to rebuild in that manner. Some people weren't able to get it. So you see the house on the left was rebuilt without raising, while the one on the right was able to being raised. So different people have different systematic access to those adaptive capacities. The other way that I kind of bring it home to me is living in Australia as I did through the summer of 2020. You are thinking about ways, or I'm thinking about ways to try to adapt to the systematic fire risk in living in this area. It made me think of satellite data on fire. There's a lot of really cool satellite data sources that I've already talked about. One that I wasn't really aware of until the last couple of years is that there are detectors on satellites that can, in real time, day by day, look at the ongoing fires around the world. This is a snapshot of that from a few days ago, August 21st of 2020. You see a smattering of fires in Siberia. As the area gets warmer and drier, fires are becoming more of a risk. But just look at the fires in Brazil and in sub-Saharan Africa, just the huge cluster of red of the fires around the world. You see some even in Australia now across the north. Flashback to January 1st of 2020. You can look at these data and move backwards in time. I remember quite distinctly January 1st of 2020 trying to drive to Sydney through the clouds of smoke and checking real-time updates about whether the road was going to be open. It had been closed for a while due to ongoing fires. These dots here show the fires on January 1st during some of the worst of the fires. It might not look that significant there, but if you just compare the millions of acres that we lost here compared to what's going on that same day across sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and India, it just shows the environmental challenges that we face. Some of it might get international news, like the Australian fires did in January of 2020, but others that can go on in developing countries don't get that same amount of attention. So how do we adapt to those kind of changing conditions? Don't install flammable cladding on the outside of your high-rise apartments would be one, but find other ways of securing your resources and your livelihood to be able to deal with those kind of challenges, right? So you can either do nothing except the costs, try to mitigate and adapt to it through changing building standards, through stockpiling water, or making some kind of changes at the governmental level, or you can decide at an individual level to leave, right? So leave, exit voice and loyalty, exit is that last one you can leave. I showed this map in one of the earlier videos, but I think it's one of the clear examples of these kind of migration routes. The Darien Gap videos, I think, show very viscerally how there's established routes that people follow, often from word of mouth, information online now, or talking to people who have made the journey successfully, that people will often follow similar routes, which can make it easier for international organization for migration to be able to help people in need. You saw the people getting assistance once they made it to certain parts of the Darien Gap, but then it also can make it easier for people to target those people, like the bandits did in the video as well. So there's well-worn movements of people, and those people who leave can leave in a number of different ways, including by boat. This picture is one of the most remarkable I've seen of migrants trying to make it across the Mediterranean, trying to to search for a better life. So, yeah, that was a brief kind of overview of environmental migration. The takeaways for me is that there's not as clear of a definition for who is considered environmental migrant, whether they should be called a refugee or not. I think the literature and the policymakers want to steer it away from considering these people refugees because of a lack of persecution being involved in their decision to move, that it's more of a structural or background condition. It's similar to creating environmental scarcity that would lead traditional environmental migration to occur. So with that, let's start moving to looking at other causes and effects of these migration flows that we've covered so far.